Hi there. My name is Eros Elizabeth Bathory, and welcome to episode 2 of the Poser's Guide to Black Metal. Essentially, previous episode, first wave bands of black metal, they talked about Satan, talked about Satanism. They didn't actually worship Satan. For an extremely angsty teen all the way in Norway, he very much hated the way that this first wave of black metal bands operated, you know. Why sing about such evil things if you didn't put them into practice? And for today's episode, we get to focus on how this one teenager started a movement that both heavily influenced the genre of black metal, but also gave it its very notorious criminal background. Oh shit, I'm here. Slap on some corpse paint, grab a lighter, and let's watch this fucker burn. Oh, it's not burning. You can't make this shit up. Yeah!
The history of second wave black metal can't be explained without first explaining the story of Mayhem, which will probably make most normal people or even diehards of the genre sigh, because I will admit, telling the story of Mayhem is a bit of the black metal equivalent of a Lord of the Rings fan telling you about the scene where Aragorn kicks the Uruk-hai helmet. By the way, did you also know that filming for this scene in Lord of the Rings? So Mayhem formed around the early 1980s, initially being called Musta, which was Finnish for black. The band was started by bassist Bjorn Stuberud and drummer Kjetil Mannheim. They were inspired by the likes of Motorhead, Venom, and other first wave bands that I mentioned in the previous episode. By the way, you should check out the previous episode of the Poser's Guide to Black Metal. It wasn't until a member by the name of Øystein Arseth, I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm gonna be butchering a lot of Norwegian names in this video. I'm sorry in advance for that. Øystein, he joined the band, and he proved to be the most influential member of said band, which, no shit. But the beginners might not know that. With Arseth as the spearhead of the band, they all decided to adopt pseudonyms, which would be easier to pronounce and remember for English-speaking audiences. Stuberud went by Necro Butcher, Mannheim went by Mannheim, and Arseth went by Destructor, before dyeing his hair black and then eventually changing it to Euronymous. Mayhem's initial lineup at this time also consisted of 2 temporary vocalists, Messiah and Maniac. They would help go on to record their first EP, Death Crush. By the way, once again, represent. But following the release of Death Crush, this lineup split off immediately. Messiah and Maniac obviously were temporary vocalists. They weren't going to be permanent members. Mannheim had left due to He kind of believed that the band was done, it reached its peak, and he wanted to focus on getting his life together, much at the behest of his girlfriend. So Mayhem's most iconic lineup would be formed when Jan Axel Blomberg and Pelle Olin had joined the band. Jan Axel joined going by Hellhammer as Mayhem's drummer, while Pelle came in as both the singer and the main person behind a lot of Mayhem's creative vision at the time. Both Jan Axel and Pelle both amazed Euronymous when he first heard what they could do, but Pelle especially caught his interest due to a character Pelle carried over from his previous band Morbid, known as Dead. Dead was inspired by Pelle's fascination with death, suicide, and a near-death experience he faced in his early childhood due to extreme bullying. This lineup of Mayhem wouldn't last long because tragically on April 8th, 1991, Pelle Olin had killed himself via shotgun. He was 22 years old when he had died. Now, instead of calling the cops when he discovered his body, Euronymous decided to rearrange both the gun and a knife he had used earlier to try and kill himself, took photos of the body, and would also take bits of skull that were left around the room to make necklaces out of them. The photos Euronymous took would go on to be the cover for the bootleg album known as Dawn of the Black Hearts, and these skull fragment bone necklaces would be given to future trusted members within the black metal community. Both the photos and the necklaces very obviously made bassist Necro Butcher sick because, you know, he did kind of like the evil image that Mayhem was presenting, but he didn't like the extremes that they would go to preserve that evil image. Very obviously. He just didn't like how Euronymous kind of made a carnival scene out of Pele's dead body, and because of that, he left the band in anger and with an extreme grudge towards Euronymous. With the death of Dead and Necro Butcher leaving, Euronymous kind of had to put Mayhem on the back burner until he could find replacements, but it was at this time he also decided to start putting more of a focus on starting other black metal bands and forming a more closely knit community. It's at this point that Euronymous opened his record shop Helveta and formed the Satanic Black Circle, which was a black metal mafia dedicated to Euronymous and his most trusted black metal acolytes. Something I should also mention from around this time is that Euronymous also had a shit ton of pen pals from around the world in order to promote this new sound of black metal. The most notable of these pen pals was a teenager by the name of Christian Vikernes. He would go on to change his name to Varg and meet Euronymous in person, and from here is where black metal kind of goes off the rails. Something I don't think I mentioned earlier is that Pele influenced a lot of the evil imagery that Euronymous would use for Mayhem, but once Varg kind of came along, he made sure that a lot of this evil imagery was put into practice, and he really tested how dedicated both Euronymous and other fans of the scene were to the evil image that was presented by Mayhem. It's here that the black metal scene reaches its peak infamy because Varg kind of becomes a very close member of the Black Circle as well as bassist of Mayhem, and at this point, this is where we start to see the crimes associated with the black metal genre. Everyone knows that the second wave of black metal is notorious for the numerous church burnings that were done in its name. Some sources that I've read have said up to 20 to 45 to even 50 churches were burned thanks to the black metal movement. That being said, Varg was only found responsible for the burnings of at least 4 of these churches. Varg was responsible for burning the Fantov Stave Church, the Old Asane Church, the Skjold Church, and the Holman Coleman Chapel. I probably horribly butchered all those names, but you get the point. The rest of these churches were likely done by other devoted fans of the black metal scene. But alongside these church burnings, there was also a murder attached to the black metal circle. Bard Eithen, also known as Faust, went on to murder a man by the name of Magne Andre Essen. He was a gay man who came up to Faust hoping for a sexual interaction. All of this crime eventually culminated in the death of Euronymous, which it's a bit of a curveball to throw at you, but I feel like most of you already know how the story of Mayhem ends, and it ends with Euronymous, and you're just probably... I feel like most of you just want to watch another person tell the story of Mayhem, but yeah. Varg stabbed Euronymous, and this, bit of the Mayhem story is also kind of retold most often, like when in Lord of the Rings, when Euronymous eventually began to grow a bit of a jealous hate for Varg because a lot of the black metal circle began to look up to him thanks to the church burnings that he was doing. Eventually, the second wave of black metal became more of a pissing contest and a power struggle over who could be more evil than the other guy. Once again, Euronymous was stabbed to death by Varg on April 10th, 1993. He was 25 at the time of his death, and of course, his death is what led to the black metal circle eventually being caught and properly charged for a lot of the crimes that were happening during this time. Varg was charged for the 4 churches he burned, very obviously, and Bard Eithen eventually confessed to murdering Andre Essen. As a result of the death of Euronymous, Necro Butcher eventually reunited with Hellhammer to help finish the De Mysteries Dom Satanas album that Euronymous had been working on 2 to 3 years leading up to his death. Which is funny, considering he wasn't alive to see it finish. Despite the pissing contest that was going on between Varg and Euronymous, they were still able to get a pretty solid chunk of this album recorded before Euronymous died, but once again, Necro Butcher, as well as a guitarist by the name of Blackthorn, who was the guitarist for the metal band Thorns, would go on to essentially finish what they had started. The Mysteries was released in 1994 as the closing chapter of Mayhem's story, as well as the story of the second wave of black metal as a whole. On top of using tracks from Varg and Euronymous, Pele's lyrics remain mostly unchanged from the album, and he has a writing credit as a tribute to both his untimely demise and his short-lived but still very significant influence on the black metal genre. As to be expected, satanic imagery is going to be a bit of a mainstay in black metal, but despite how much Euronymous, Varg, and all those types mention Satan out to the public, Satanic imagery really varied from band to band. Some bands included Satan in their music, some did and actually believed in the shit they were saying. There were bands like GORGOROTH where some of the members were legit like high-ranking Satanists who genuinely like used their music to promote Satan, but there were some that didn't use Satan and took more of a different route to black metal. The best way I can describe the new imagery introduced into the second wave of black metal is like, so the first wave, they're horror movies. The second wave, they're just outright like disturbing gore movies. There wasn't really horror topics, but more just like gory, like lyrics, like self-mutilation, a little bit of necrophilia. Self-harm, but not like I'm depressed self-harm. Just I love looking at my blood, which probably is depression self-harm. And then there were some bands where it was just like a very general evil image, and then like they were more focused on like the evil atmosphere. Like they make you feel like you're in like a forest on a very violent winter storm, you know, like funeral winds and fucking the whole point I'm trying to make here is like there were some bands that did have an evil image, but they didn't really have a specific like figure of that evil image. It was just like they wanted you to feel like isolated, cold, and sometimes prancing in the forest. And then there was like an even like smaller subsection of black metal bands that focused on like they had evil imagery, but it was even more fantasy inspired, like witchcraft, necromancy, sorcery, maybe I don't know for certain. I don't know if, I mean, the stuff I listen to at least hasn't featured anything like dragons or something, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is like an all-out like power metal, black metal hybrid out there. If there isn't, maybe this is my sign to start it. On the instrumental side of things, Euronymous, some bands like Emperor, Thorns, they incorporated tremolo picking as like the main staple of black metal. Tremolo picking, I really hope I don't explain this horribly. It's James Hetfield's worst nightmare. It's where you pick down and then pick back up like the same string. So it's supposed to make you play faster, essentially. The whole point of like second wave black metal really was to play sometimes as fast as possible. It really depends on what band you're listening to. On top of the heavily distorted surfer rock, bass was very underutilized in black metal. I will say that also varied from band to band too. Sometimes the bass really just, you can barely make it out. Some didn't even have the bass, and then there were some where the bass was pretty integral to the sound of the music they were trying to play. But basically, second wave black metal is like my worst nightmare because I have a bass. I'm a bass player. A really shitty one and a beginner bass player, but I really wanted to learn a lot of black metal songs on bass. So I've done a little bit of rearranging for this section for the rest of the episodes. I put the band section and then the song recommendation section into one chapter just to make it a little more cohesive. I don't know why I didn't in the last episode because, I mean, it wasn't like it was a waste of time. I think me explaining what the fuck I did is a waste of time, but yeah. I'm going to be giving you bands and then doing song recommendations from that band. Starting off this section, since this video is based around them, here are my top picks from Mayhem. And then the first notable band I will be talking about from around this time is DARKTHRONE. DARKTHRONE initially started as a death metal band in 1987, but when Euronymous came around, released Death Crush, they immediately switched to playing black metal. DARKTHRONE is probably the most commonly thrown around black metal band by black metal elitists, black metal beginners, and the people in between. I don't blame them. I mean, they're pretty iconic. DARKTHRONE really defined that raw, isolated, and cold feel that's really associated with this second wave of black metal. And with how this like era of black metal operated, on technicality, Darkthrone is like the first actual band to release a second wave black metal album, that being A Blaze in the Northern Sky. So, without further ado, here are my favorites from Darkthrone. Formed in 1991, Emperor would go hand in hand with both Mayhem and a band I'll mention later known as THORNS in developing the instrumental sound of black metal. Like, these three bands are kind of the big three of the second wave black metal movement because they were the ones that developed the tremolo picking that is associated with this genre. Emperor's most iconic song comes from their self-titled EP. So as I mentioned earlier in this video, BURZUM was a one-man project started by Varg that goes back to even before his time in Mayhem, and you know, BURZUM pretty much remains as Varg's pride and joy. BURZUM's approach to black metal was more melodic, more atmospheric, and there were lyrics in some of the songs, but there was a lot more focus on instrumental rather than like the vocals. Varg really let the music explain itself rather than the vocals. This is how it would go on to really inspire the symphonic and other melodic bands that would come after Mayhem. Yeah, here are my favorites from BURZUM. And then following his arrest, Varg would go on to, I think he outright just stopped doing black metal and just focused on doing like dark ambient music because I think he really started to just use the keyboard more than the guitar. So he focused on going more that route instead of metal. And I think his last ever metal track was the song Back to the Shadows, which he did I think it was a live stream in 2012. That's going to be something I'm going to actually mention later on in this video. Dissection formed in 1989 and first disbanded in 1997 following the arrest of lead singer and guitarist John Nodvite. He was charged with being an accessory for murder. Once he was released from prison, Dissection got back together in 2004, and then abruptly ended in 2006 following the suicide of Nodvite on August 13th. If you love the sound of Mayhem, minus Attila's vocals, no offense, you're really gonna love Dissection. Hold on. If you love, I'd highly recommend listening to their first two albums, The Somber Lane and Storm of the Lightsbane, because I feel like both of these albums really, they're an elaboration, a continuation, and maybe even a perfection of the sound that Euronymous was trying to achieve with the Mysteries and so much more. Like, I can't recommend this album enough, and I'm just gonna let you listen for yourself.
Strength, carry me through the years.
Thorns is a bit of an interesting one to talk about. As I mentioned earlier, it's like one of the big three of Euronymous' Black Circle, and despite like the low amount of like albums, EPs, and like a very high amount of demos, they still very highly impacted how the second wave of black metal would sound. I think some of these riffs from these demo tapes would even go on to be used for some of the songs on The Mysteries. ABRUPTUM was a two-man band initially consisting of the members It and All. I am not playing. It, also known as Tony Sarka, was a very trusted member of the Black Circle. He was even signed under Euronymous' label, Death Like Silence Productions, which, by the way, Euronymous also started his own record label following the opening of Helvete. I don't know why I didn't mention that when I mentioned Helvete earlier, but yeah, he had his own record label, and It even has the honor of having Euronymous highly praised ABRUPTUM. ABRUPTUM takes the ambient approach to second wave black metal to its extremes. I really don't know how to describe it to you other than if somebody normal were to describe ABRUPTUM as noise, I would probably agree with them, because there's definitely instrumentals in ABRUPTUM songs, but there's a very large focus on ambience, and a lot of the screams and the vocals that are in ABRUPTUM songs are less coherent and more just like the dude's in pain, and somehow I still love it. So Immortal formed in 1991 with their initial and probably most iconic lineup consisting of bassist and vocalist Abbott, guitarists Demonaz and Jorn Thunberg, as well as drummer Armageddon. Immortal and Dissection, they're part of my top 10 black metal bands, as well as my favorite metal bands of all time. Like, I could genuinely gush about these two. Diabolical Full Moon Mysticism is like my all-time fucking favorite, like, black metal album. Like, I can't, like, express how much I fucking love it. Like, can barely contain myself. I feel a little gay saying that, which, I mean, I am, but yeah. Diabolical Full Moon Mysticism, it's like a 10 out of 10 album. It has that, it's a slow but very beautiful sounding album. I'm gonna let you listen for yourself so you know what the fuck I'm talking about. GORGOROTH formed in 1992 in Sandefjord, Norway. They released 10 studio albums, 2 demos, and have also gone through a shit ton of band members. When doing research on, like, stuff on GORGOROTH, aside from the crime, which I will get on later, I found a WordPress hit piece where they called GORGOROTH, like, posers for the second wave of black metal. Like, they were just like, I don't know how to describe how they fucking, but I mean, you'll get the basic gist of it when I say that, like, this hit piece also described the lead guitarist in Furnace as a cuck. starting Immortal, Abath was actually in an older band known as Old Funeral. The only reason why I felt that this would be kind of important to mention is because of the fact that Varg was actually a guitarist for this band before they split up. Gull, who was the most prominent lead singer of the band GORGOROTH, was arrested and charged with aggravated assault in 2006. This was because in 2002, he had kidnapped and tortured a man in his basement. Apparently, this dude came up to him first. There's a wide array of biographical documentaries and just other bits of media as a whole regarding the second wave of black metal and their rambunctious misadventures. None have reached as much infamy as the book Lords of Chaos, which this book horribly covers Euronymous and the black metal circle's doings, as well as interviewing key members of the black metal scene and taking them extremely out of context. The book comes off more as just butchering the history of black metal rather than someone who is actually interested in introducing a mainstream audience to a fan base that's really notorious for being closed off and potentially violent. Blackthorne, who is the lead guitarist for the band Thorns, was an accessory to Euronymous' murder. He was the one that drove Varg to Euronymous' apartment leading up to the stabbing. There is a Lords of Chaos movie that is based off of the Lords of Chaos book, and it somehow manages to butcher the story of Mayhem even worse than the book.
We are Lords of Chaos, destroyer of worlds.
There's a lot of very horrid inclusions, creative decisions that were included in this movie, but the most infamous one is the inclusion of a girlfriend character to make Euronymous relatable and sympathetic. In reality, I don't think any of these people could pull a girlfriend, let alone be brave enough to talk to a woman when they were in their peak, but despite that, I'm also actually a big fan of this Lord of Chaos movie. It's a guilty pleasure movie, but I also don't take it as a story of Mayhem. I take it rather as a story based on Mayhem. If you want a legit documentary or a movie that talks about the story of Mayhem, I'd recommend documentaries like Until the Light Takes Us or Helvete. But I also recommend the YouTube documentary by Resonant Peak. It's a pretty solid Mayhem documentary, and I'd highly just recommend watching it. I think it's the shortest one. It's only 58 minutes long, and it covers a lot in such a short amount of time. Lords of Chaos is also directed by Jonas Åkerlund, who was the session drummer for Bathory's self-titled. He also directed the music video for a song known as Bewitched by the doom metal band known as Candlemass, one of my favorite doom metal bands. The only reason why I'm mentioning this music video is because of the fact Pele shows up as a background actor for this music video. He is one of the hypnotized metalheads who's headbanging and doom marching towards the end of the video. Dead is also seen in the wild in this specific piece of footage I used of Korathon in Sweden. It's also important to note that in this moment, Dead realized how much of a poser Korathon was, because as I mentioned earlier, none of these bands were legitimately going around spending their time killing babies or sacrificing virgins. I guess Pele was expecting this guy to be a hell priest of sorts. As Dead himself would put it, he was disappointed that he was a glam metal wimp. Dead had cut himself with a piece of glass on stage following his first performance with Mayhem in Jessheim. He cut so deep and the bleeding was so bad that he had to immediately patch himself up before finishing the show. Dead would also sniff the remains of dead animals before live shows and even slept with some of them under his bed to really surround himself in the stench of death. He also buried his stage clothes to make them rot and appear more like a zombified corpse. If you couldn't tell, Dead was a man that was very dedicated to his craft, which I simultaneously respect and am a little concerned about. Another legend surrounding Dead is the fact that when he auditioned for Mayhem, he also gave Euronymous and Necrobutcher the pleasant surprise of a crucified rat in the envelope. Did you know that in this interview we find out Necrobutcher was actually on his way to kill Euronymous himself before Varg beat him to it? But he's not the only one. Justin Bieber, MLK, even Louis Armstrong had beef with Euronymous and wanted to kill him tremendously.
I'm gonna kill you, Euronymous. You make me sick. You're a piece of shit. And I hate you. And I think to myself, what a terrible dude.
I talked a lot about BURZUM in this video, but I tried my hardest not to really talk about the man behind it, known as Varg, because a big elephant in the room is the fact that Varg is an extreme white supremacist and racist. Varg was always kind of like this, even before he met Euronymous, I would assume so, but there's a lot of back and forth whether or not he really was a neo-Nazi of sorts, because he shares a lot of views like a lot of anti-Semite views, but he never himself outright confessed to being a Nazi. And I don't know, it's a little bit rocky, but the main takeaway I want you guys to have from this section is that Varg is very obviously a very horrible racist and most likely a homophobe. Varg used to actually have a YouTube channel where he would peddle a lot of these white supremacist views, but as to be expected, he got banned from YouTube as well as social media as a whole. I'm a little 50-50 on the banning because I wish that they didn't ban it just so that we could have like an archive of what this fucking dude said, but at the same time, there is definitely people that did share a lot of his beliefs. In my personal opinion, I'd like to separate art from the artist. Like, I genuinely love BURZUM. I can appreciate good music. I love what it did for the second wave of black metal. BURZUM had a lot of impact for me mentally. Like, it helped me get through a lot of shit, but that doesn't mean I look up to the guy behind it, nor do I even think that he would accept the fact that I specifically listen to his music. And in my case, at least in my case specifically, I kind of listen to BURZUM more out of spite because I don't really think that he would be fond of me specifically listening to his music because there's something very obvious here that Varg wouldn't like about me. I think it's a little sad, but I also think it's kind of funny about the idea that, like, Varg would very much hate that a brown Asian twink is listening to his music when his core audience would probably be a bunch of white basement-dwelling skinheads. But yeah, my main takeaway is I love the music, but I acknowledge that there's a lot of controversial stuff behind the man behind it, and I don't look up to him, I just despise him, and I even make fun of him. Did you know that if you read between the lines of the Lords of Chaos movie, you can almost make out a bit of a forbidden gay romance between Varg and Euronymous? And then the last fact I'd like to close off this section on is the fact that the person who plays Varg in the Lords of Chaos film is a Jewish person. Varg very much wasn't a fan of that, and when he still had his YouTube channel, he was very outspoken about being played by a Jewish actor. So if you really didn't think he was a Nazi when I mentioned it, I'm gonna leave you off with that. And with that, we reached the end of episode 2 of the Poser's Guide to Second Wave Black Metal. I really hope you like my coverage of Mayhem's story and other bits of fucking trivia in between, because there's a lot. There was a lot. For a general summary, it was a very long summary of the story of Mayhem in the black metal circle. I will acknowledge that I did include a lot of shit in this video, but I still know that there was a lot that I barely got to cover. I barely scratched the surface of second wave black metal. I really tried my best to condense a lot of this shit down, but there's only so much I can condense without bastardizing the topic or pissing off the elitists. I'm not gonna please everyone, but I wanna at least please myself. Pause. I feel like after these main episodes of the Poser's Guides, I will go back to like some of these episodes and elaborate on some stuff I left out in the previous, but until we get to that point, there's going to be at least 4 more episodes of this Poser's Guide to Black Metal stuff. The next episode, episode 3, I'm going to be talking about Les Legion Noires, which is a French movement that started in response to the Norwegian scene that I literally just talked about in this fucking video. Following that, I'm going to be talking about the American movement of black metal as well as the depressive suicidal movement that showed up, or I guess around the same time. I think from there I'll be talking about those 3, and then I'll be finishing off like the main episodes of this series by acknowledging the National Socialist black metal movement. That one's going to be a very interesting one to cover, but until we reach that moment, let's just focus on part 3 for now. Yeah, this isn't an official declaration on how many episodes I'll have for this Poser's Guide series. Like I said earlier, I might go back and acknowledge some stuff I might have missed out on in the previous, but I might also even just touch on other fringes of black metal that I didn't even get to focus on or didn't think about as I'm like planning out this series. Like right now, I'm realizing I might do a Poser's Guide on black noise, like, you know, Gnaw Their Tongues, the Emit Project, all these types of black metal. I'm for sure going to be talking about them in their own Poser's Guides, but yeah. Until we reach that point, like, comment, and subscribe if you like this video. Hail Satan, and stay tuned for part 3. These are still going to be enjoyable to watch, even though I got through the most publicized black metal genre. Yeah, I love y'all. No homo, or full homo, but no Diddy, because yeah, I'm just wasting time here. I'm gonna leave.